Welcome to Readathon, Part 4, Dark Shadows Story Digest Magazine, The Interrupted Voyage, Part 4, fourth and final part. Barnabas began to quickly pace the floor of his cell, his hand held firmly to his chin as he plunged his mind into deep thought. "There is a way," he burst out again, heedless of the grumblings of the jailer, who listened to the ravings of a madman in his jail. "If Annabella were only here, if somehow she could come to me, if I could reach her, wherever she is, if she could come." He closed his eyes tightly and thought of Annabella, whose innocence had suffered for 160 years. "Annabella!" he cried. "Annabella!" Dazed, Annabella walked the cobbled streets aimlessly. She was aware of a passage of time, a loss of continuity, a void in her life. How long, she wondered. The last I remember it was night. Now suddenly it is day. Has it been hours or days? What happened to me? She struggled to remember. She had a vague recollection of Michael. Or did she? That awful brute. Could it really have been Michael? Maybe it was her imagination. A bad dream. Maybe she was dreaming even now. If only her senses would clear. If only she could grasp what was going on. Suddenly she heard a familiar sound. At least she thought she did. She stopped to listen. Her senses at stiff attention. Did I really hear it? She asked herself, or was it my imagination? Then she heard it again. It was a voice she recognized, clear and strong, crying for help. "Barnabas! Barnabas is calling to me, in a voice only I can hear." She turned her head this way and that, seeking its direction. "Barnabas," she signaled, "where are you? I'm coming, but tell me which way to go." She was conscious of an answer, a beam of thought guiding her steps. She ran as fast as her feet would carry her. At the town square, her way was blocked by a churning mob of strangely silent people. She pushed and shoved her way into the crowd. Across the square, she saw the jail and now realized that this was her goal. This was where she would find Barnabas. For what seemed to be ages, Annabella struggled against the unrelenting crowd. At last she stood in front of the jail door. "I will reveal who I am," she said as she pounded on the door. "They will listen when they hear my story. They will let me in when they learn who I am." Her pounding brought the jailer to the door. He looked into her eyes, and a strange expression came over his face. His eyes glazed and his mouth dropped open. He opened the door to Annabella without saying a word. Annabella dashed past him, puzzled that he had not made an effort to stop her, nor to learn who she was. As she ran into the dark interior of the jail, the man dropped to the floor as if in a faint. "Barnabas," she called, searching each dank cell as she hurried from one door to the next. "Barnabas, it is I, Annabella." Barnabas ran to his cell door. He looked at the girl who stood before him. One look in her eyes told him this was really Annabella. Hurry, he said. "There is not much time." Instead of listening as Barnabas asked, Annabella ran to the jailer's desk and lifted the key from the hook above it. She returned and thrust it into the door. "No," called Barnabas. "Escape is no use. The crowds would have us again before we could get away." He thrust his arm through the narrow window and held her from opening the door. "If we are both caught together, all hope will be gone." Annabella looked at him with unbelieving eyes. "There is another way," he quickly said, "a way which will free all of us." Annabella listened as Barnabas told her what to do. She turned from him quickly when he had finished and hurried for the door. She slipped by the unconscious jailer and quietly closed the door behind her. "I must get Michael," she said. "Barnabas says I must get Michael and bring him here." She looked at the vast crowd on the square. Uncertainty filled her bosom. "But how?" she cried. "How?" She rushed from the square toward the cemetery where Barnabas told her Michael could be found. Her flying feet carried her through empty streets to the edge of town. High above her, on a bleak hill, were the rough-hewn tombs of the unhallowed burial ground. She stopped and looked up to the top. "Oh, Michael," she pleaded, "I love you. No matter what happens, Michael," she said as she began the long climb to the hilltop. "I love you." Deep in the dark crypt which covered him, Michael stirred. Calandra looked to him. "Are you restless, Michael?" she asked. "Does your feeble mind still yearn to be free?" She walked to him and lifted his head and looked deeply into his dulled eyes. "Be free, then," she said. "Be free and go." She pointed to the heavy iron door. Then an evil laugh broke from her lips. "Go and return, you fool. You will always do my bidding as long as this remains with me." She clutched at the chain and withdrew the black amulet. Hysterical laughter cackled from her bloodless lips. "Go," she ordered. "Go to the town and learn what has happened." Then, her eyes narrowing and her voice rasping with a sinister snarl, she threw open the door for him. "But remember, Michael, you are in my power for eternity. Now go and return." She slammed the door behind him, its ringing clang sounding loud through the air of death which hung over the place. Annabella started at an unfamiliar noise. "A bell," she said aloud, or the clanging of a rusty gate?" She turned to the direction of the sound. A strange form advanced toward her, walking slowly and methodically as if under a spell. "Michael," she cried, "you have come." It was the same brute she had struggled with once before, but this time she felt no fear, no revulsion. Barnabas had given her hope that she could free this inhuman creature from his bondage and restore his identity as Michael, the man she loved. Annabella ran to him. Mechanically, he moved to brush her aside, but now she had the strength and will to grab him and pull his tormented face to hers. "Michael," she cried, "let me help you, please, let me help." An odd light flickered in Michael's eyes, as if a glimmer of hope still rested in the farthest crevice of his mind. He looked down at the strange face before him. A puzzled look came over him. "Annabella?" His voice was dull and raspy, but the word it spoke brought added light to the flicker in his eyes. "Annabella," he repeated. "Annabella!" Annabella cried with joy. "Oh, yes, Michael, yes. It is Annabella, it is." The sound of a chime striking from the town below swept the happiness from her face. "Barnabas," she cried, "the hour is near." She listened as the chimes rang out again. "Oh," she shuddered, throwing her hands to her face in horror. 2:30. The time is but a half-hour away." Michael stared dumbly at her. Without speaking further, Annabella took Michael's hand and began to run toward the town below. Like a dog on a leash, the sad-faced youth followed, his spirit drained away and imprisoned within the depths of a crypt below. Chapter 24. The Fiery Stake. The crowd which filled the square began to mill with excitement as the clock in the tower chimed the remaining half-hour to the execution they had gathered to see. They began to chant the minutes as they passed. Soon the entire mass of people called in unison like a giant chorus as each 60 seconds clicked off on the clock above their heads. 29, they shouted with glee, then exactly 1 minute later, 28, and again, 27. Annabella listened to the strange chant as she hurried toward the square. Michael trailed her, held tightly by her warm hand, which gripped his arm. "They are counting the minutes," she exclaimed. "Oh, Faith," she cried, "give us time." All eyes were on the huge clock as she and Michael reached the jail door. 20, shouted the crowd as the clock's hands relentlessly moved upward over the marks which meant a minute less life for their hapless prisoner. Pushing quickly against the door, Annabella and Michael entered the jail. Lying in his place where the recollection of Angelique's evil stare had dropped him was the jailer. They passed him quickly and hurried to Barnabas's cell. Barnabas looked at Michael's blank face for a moment and then began to remove his cape. Go to the door, he called to Annabella. "You must watch to see that no one enters before I have finished." She looked at him hopefully and then vanished up the dusty corridor. The chanting of the crowd continued, the dim sound of their chants coming softly through the stone walls and wood doors of the jail as Barnabas stripped himself of his clothes. 16, the chant sounded. 15. Less than a quarter of an hour, Barnabas said breathily as he loosened Michael's shirt and pulled it quickly from his back. He had enough time to do what I must. He hurriedly put on Michael's clothes, and then quickly placed his own on Michael. At 5 minutes before the hour, Annabella ran desperately back to the cell. "They are coming," she called. "They will reach the door in a minute." The cell door opened, and Barnabas, dressed in Michael's clothes, stepped out. All is in readiness," he said as he looked back into the cell. "They will have their victim." He shuddered as he looked on the drooping figure of Michael, who stood in Barnabas's clothes, in the middle of the cell, his face hidden in a turn of the cape. The chanting voices reached 3 as Barnabas and Annabella slipped out of the jail door a scant few seconds before the men came to lead him to the pyre. They hid in the crowd as the men entered the jail. The jailer stood dazed as the men entered. Where is your devil?" they asked. With a puzzled look on his face, the jailer led them to the cell in the rear of the jail. "One!" screamed the crowd in a frenzy as the black-caped figure they despised emerged from the jail between his guards. "Look!" cried one, "his head is bowed. I want to see his face." "He will not hide it when the fire reaches him," shouted another. A laugh went up from the crowd. Annabella clung closely to Barnabas as she watched in horror as Michael was led toward the pyre. "What will happen?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the murmur which rushed through the crowd as Michael began to climb the steps to the stake. Before Barnabas could answer, a voice shouted over the roar of the crowd. "Michael!" It called, "Michael!" He whirled. Forcing her way through the crowd toward him was Calandra. "It is she!" glared Barnabas as he saw for the first time the face of the witch who had visited such terror on him and on Annabella. He whispered to Annabella, "Quickly, leave my side. She thinks I am Michael. She must not discover her error until it is too late." Annabella hesitated and slipped deeper into the crowd as Calandra's voice grew louder. "Michael," she cried, "I command you to listen." She shouted at Barnabas, dressed in Michael's clothes. Barnabas looked to the pyre. Calandra's words reached Michael's ears, and he began to move. The man charged with lightning. The tinder, dry faggots which encircled him touched a spark to his torch. Immediately it roared to life, long, slender fingers of fire leaping into the clear blue sky. "Now!" screamed the crowd as the hand of the clock moved jerkily to 3 o'clock. Michael raised his head in answer to Calandra's shouts. The cape fell away from his face. "No!" screamed Calandra as she looked up to see Michael instead of Barnabas at the stake. "It is the wrong man!" she cried, jumping to the platform as the man with the torch bent low to touch the ready wood. "No!" she cried and pointed to Barnabas in the crowd. "There is the man you want!" "There's the man you want, not this man!" she screamed as she spun to face Michael. Turning, she slipped. With a fearful shriek of terror, she clutched at the air. The torch fell from her grip and landed on the wood. It burst into flame. Fire leaped from the pyre and instantly engulfed her as she lay on the platform in view of the gasping crowd. An explosion ripped the sky as an immense ball of fiery flame and smoke shot into the heavens. The fire vanished as quickly as it had come. The crowd was stunned. The platform which held the stake was bare. There was no sign of either victim. An overwhelming silence encompassed the scene. Barnabas walked to the platform's edge where a small object caught his eye. He bent down to retrieve it. Between his fingers, cold as the earth, was the amulet. For a brief moment he studied it, and then gripping the iron object tightly, he opened the top. He reached his fingers into the hollow of the talisman and pulled out a lock of black, shiny hair. He smiled softly, a look of understanding and compassion passing over his kind-hearted face. Letting the bits of hair sprinkle gently the fresh breeze which blew from the sea, he turned to Annabella. "He is free now, Annabella. He is free." No answer came in reply. Annabella was gone. Chapter 25. Souls at Peace. Barnabas walked quietly along the beach. Behind him in the bright afternoon sun was Salem, its rooftops and buildings beginning to fade from sight. A quiet smile of contentment was on his lips as he walked slowly away. Then, as if to answer a call from above, he turned his head upward. In the heavens, high above him, shone two bright lights, side by side. As he watched, they too began to fade. Soon they were gone. "They are together at last," he said. "Forever." Far down the beach, a bearded figure bent over a shattered board which had washed onto the shore. Barnabas watched as the man lifted the board and carried it to a wagon, which was already nearly filled with other planks and pieces of wreckage of Silent Arrow. The captain, thought Barnabas as he watched the old man drive off. A single horse, pulling the load of what had once been a beautiful ship. His foot stepped on something hard. Barnabas looked down. Under his boot was a plank from the deck of Silent Arrow. He stared at the board. The sand which surrounded it began to blur. His vision began to grow dim. The board beneath his feet began to move. Barnabas placed a hand to his head. Dizziness overtook him. He reached out for something to support him, though he knew there was nothing within his grasp on the lonely beach. His hand struck an object. Brief pain stung his fingertips. Barnabas blinked his eyes. The board still rested beneath his feet, but now it was surrounded by others. He raised his head. His hand held tightly to a chair which rested on the floor of the captain's room. He had returned. He looked around the room. The sounds of the sea were gone. The light he had seen from the garden was gone. Annabella is gone, he said. He turned and left the room, quietly closing the door behind him. "They are together at last," he said softly as a satisfied smile played over his lips. "Together at last." The end. Well,